The year is 1298, and in the rebellious land of Scotland, one name is on the lips of every patriot. Indeed, the name William Wallace will be forever etched into the national psyche of Scots. The loyal supporter of the deposed King John Balliol, having jointly scored a spectacular victory over the army of John de Warenne at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Wallace pushed south in October of 1297 with an army of around 3,000 men. The Scots leader forging for himself a reputation for savagery as he torched and ravaged to Corbridge and Hexham, before moving his unruly men into Cumberland and then Carlisle. Carlisle proved too tough to crack without siege equipment, and hence all the Scots could accomplish was to blockade the English under Henry Percy, while they continued to fire and destroy the lands around it. Fortunately for the beleaguered English, they were not the Scots' most formidable opponent at that time, with the coming winter weather driving them back east towards Durham. This target too was foregone due to heavy snows, the Scots instead heading for Newcastle. However, Newcastle too remained untaken, the combination of foul weather and the Scots' own eagerness to return north with their plunder, driving Wallace back to his homeland by early December. On the surface, little was achieved by the raid, with 3 major targets remaining in enemy hands. However, the effects are more nuanced than mere territorial gain. Wallace and his Scots plundered abundantly, significantly adding to their war chest through plunder and extortion payments. The raid also served to both boost morale and solidify Wallace's own position as the de facto leader of national resistance. The raid was just retribution for the Scots' own suffering at the hands of King Edward and his lieutenants. Perhaps common memories of the brutal sack of Berwick drove the avenging Scots on in those dying months of 1297. But before we continue, I want to shout out today's sponsor, Established Titles. Established Titles is a project based on a historic Scottish custom where landowners are referred to as lairds, lords, and ladies. What Established Titles does is give you 1 square foot of land so you can call yourself a lord or a lady, and provides you with an official certificate with a crest. Once you have your certificate, you'll have a unique plot number to see the exact location of your land. And by owning this land, Established Titles allows you to change your name to Lord or Lady on credit cards, plane tickets, or even dating profiles, and much, much more. Through doing this, Established Titles plants a tree with every order and works with global charities, One Tree Planted and Trees for the Future, to support reforestation efforts. And Established Titles told me that the first 200 people purchasing a title pack using my link will effectively be next to my plot, just a few minutes walk between each other. And depending on how many of you want to become a lord or lady, we can build our own little HistoryMarche kingdom. It makes an amazing last-minute gift, and Established Titles is actually running a massive sale. Plus, if you use the code MARCH10, you get an additional 10% off. Go to establishedtitles.com/march10 to get your gifts now and help support the channel. The Scots nobility, for its part, largely endorsed Wallace's actions, as at some point during the winter months of 1297 into 1298, the victor of Stirling Bridge was knighted by a major earl of the realm, perhaps even Robert Bruce, the future king, and victor at Bannockburn. Wallace was also elected guardian of the kingdom in the name of King John Balliol, who still lived. Scotland's champion now had official sanction and support of at least some of the nobility. He would need it, as if Stirling Bridge had achieved nothing else, it had provoked a unified drive in the English to crush the Scots in 1298. As for the English, they had not meekly hidden behind their walls in the aftermath of Stirling. Robert Bruce emerged around this time in rebellion, and Robert Clifford launched a raid of his own into Annandale in response. The battle had far from broken the resolve of the English, though the occupying forces had been largely driven out. By October 23rd, men to the number of 30,000 had been summoned, the muster of this force to centre at Newcastle by the December 6th. Assembling any kind of force at such short notice was no easy feat. In the event, some 18,500 advanced north, earlier on in 1298, relieving the castles at Berwick and Roxburgh. At this point, operations were paused on the orders of King Edward Longshanks himself, still present in Flanders. This may have been foolish, given the delay gave the Scots precious time to consolidate and brace for the inevitable response. However, Stirling must have heavily influenced this decision, the loss persuading Edward to personally oversee the reconquest of what he considered a rebellious vassal folk. At this point, it's helpful to circle back on the character and recent times of Edward. He had not presided over the loss at Stirling, instead overseeing English efforts against their other old enemy, the French, in Flanders. Edward too had much to distract him from matters further north. Indeed, Edward had partially acted against the Scots to begin in 1296, due to their open alliance with the French. The French King Philip, having confiscated Edward's lands in Gascony, proved another formidable opponent to vex the English monarch. Edward also faced problems with some of his own great nobles, specifically around this time led by the Earls of Norfolk and Hereford. Opposition to the king centered around the main complaints of excessive extractions in the form of prizes and taxation, as well as over military service in Edward's wars. While agreeing in principle to rendering military service, Norfolk famously refused at Salisbury in February of 1297, as Edward himself would not lead him on that occasion. Edward angrily declared, "By God, Sir Earl, either go or hang," which was smoothly parried with Norfolk's own response, "By the same oath, O King, I shall neither go nor hang." On the matter of taxation, the opposition in the form of Norfolk and Hereford even went so far as to block collection of taxes in the Exchequer itself on the very day Edward himself embarked for Flanders. The prospect for a unified front against the Scots thus looked bleak at best by the fall of 1297. Edward's foray in Flanders achieved little. His grand coalition against the French proved a non-starter, the King of the Romans failing to support him, and the Flemish themselves were flaky in their allegiance, thus prompting Edward to move from Bruges to Ghent. Here, Edward had to stamp his authority on the recalcitrant citizens to fully control the place. It's probable that Edward received news of events in Scotland by early October. Certainly, on the 9th of the month, he had agreed a 2-month truce with Philip, though he would remain in the area for a further 6 months. In England, the prince's government came to an agreement with the opposition, with the confirmation of the charters of Magna Carta and of the Forest. In addition, future exactions in the form of levies and prizes had to come through common assent of the realm. Edward officially okayed the agreement on the 5th of November. With a year-long truce agreed with the French on 31st of January, Edward finally returned to England by March. The king returned with a steely resolve to smash the Scots into renewed submission, evidenced with his move of the governmental HQ to York, where it would stay for 6 years. Surrey's hastily assembled force was largely dismissed during the April and May months, Edward deciding to muster a better quality force to march on the Scots. Edward called upon just 2,000 English foot from the counties of Cheshire and Lancashire respectively, with the vast majority being drawn from Wales. Edward mustering in all 10,500 foot from here. Total crossbowmen numbered around 500, with the cavalry numbering an impressive 2,200 of both paid and feudal men. The leadership roll call was also incomparable to Stirling. 11 earls, the Bishop of Durham, and no less than 115 bannerets accompanied their king. Edward entered York on the May 26th and made his intentions for Scotland plain by making a pilgrimage to the shrine of John of Beverley, a figure especially associated with battle. With the banner of John, he processed to Durham, reaching it by 12th of June, and also taking the banner of Cuthbert, a saint famed as a defender of the English against the Scots. These holy banners were the very same who had driven the Northerners to victory in 1138 against David I's invasion. As for the Scots, the swelling army of William Wallace was likely mostly based in the vicinity of Selkirk Forest throughout the spring and earlier weeks of summer. At Falkirk, the Scots would field a total of 9,500 men, 8,000 spears, and 1,500 archers. Such a force was substantial enough to cause logistical headaches even for experienced commanders. It's likely as the date of the battle loomed, Wallace thus moved his army to the Torwood for ease of supply and also to block the English route to Stirling. The Royal Army finally amassed at Roxburgh, the infantry marching from Carlisle, the whole host with Edward at its head, advancing north through a land already picked clean of resources by the Scots. This scorched earth policy was effective, with delays in supplies from sea causing rumblings in the invading force. Edward thus halted at Kirkliston near Edinburgh in July, increasingly angry at the slow supply situation. During this period of frustration, Edward sent the Bishop of Durham out to ravage 3 castles. The initial assault on Dirleton was beaten back, but after stiff words of encouragement from Edward, the task was completed. Dirleton was taken after supplies arrived to reinvigorate Durham's force, and the other 2 were fired after their abandonment. This minor success was offset by trouble in the main English camp. Not all the supplies arrived at once. A large quantity of wine came before any significant load of food, and the larger Welsh contingent liberally indulged themselves with predictable results. Drunkenness combined with hunger devolved into a mass brawl that threatened the integrity of the Royal Army, the Welsh killing some priests who tried to calm the situation, prompting English men-at-arms to intervene. All in all, some 80 Welshmen were slain, and the group withdrew apart from the army. This incident likely did not involve all the Welsh in Edward's army, but was damaging enough. It was at this low point that some good news finally came in. The Earls of Dunbar and Angus presented the king with a spy who informed him that the Scots were around 18 miles west, waiting to pounce on the retreating English and raid their camp. With renewed vigour, Edward led his army west, camping at Linlithgow on the 21st of July. Tensions were clearly high, as the royal host was ordered to remain arrayed for battle throughout the night. In a final misfortune, Edward himself was wounded, but not by attacking Scots, but by his own horse, whom a careless squire had not secured properly. Nonetheless, the men mistook the commotion for an attack, panic quickly spreading before Edward himself painfully restored order. Mounting his steed, he proceeded towards Falkirk long before the dawn. Unlike Stirling Bridge, the exact site of battle is not definitively known. Since no precise landmarks distinguished it, there are candidates north and south of Falkirk itself. Wallace had positioned his men on high ground to the south of Callender Wood. His 8,000 spearmen formed into 4 tightly packed circular schiltrons. Tactically, this was a sound move, the Scottish commander likely basing his decision on his knowledge of the English use of heavy cavalry. Since the schiltrons were not anchored to any natural feature, their circular form would enable opposition to a charge from all directions. Guarding the gaps between the schiltrons were Wallace's 1,500 bowmen, though their numbers paled in comparison to Edward's 5,500 longbowmen. The confluence of the Glen and West Quarter burns created a boggy obstacle to any direct assault. funneling potential assaults towards the flanks. Guarding those flanks towards the rear, to presumably oppose the charge of Edward's horse, was about 500 cavalry under the command of James, the High Steward. Having settled on this stance, Wallace famously shouted to his stoutly arrayed Scots, "I have brought you to the ring. Hop if you can." Initially hesitant to immediately attack, Edward allowed his heavy cavalry to probe the Scots with an unsupported attack. The infantry were yet to fully deploy to the field, still advancing from Linlithgow. Charging in 4 battles, the Earls of Lincoln and Hereford, as well as Roger Bigod, the Earl Marshal of England, led the vanguard, with Surrey's battle in support, while the right flank was led by the Battle of Anthony Beck, the Bishop of Durham, as well as King Edward's battle. King Edward himself may have not directly engaged in the thick of the fighting, but would certainly have ridden with an elite bodyguard of chosen knights. Initially, the charge was halted by the marshy terrain that had been unmarked. However, the battles quickly veered around and reorganized to attack the flanks instead. Lincoln's battle, outclassing and outnumbering the Scots cavalry on his wing, made quick work of them, killing or driving them from the field. Some Scots may have dismounted and escaped to the Chilterns to continue the fight on foot, but what is sure is that the Scots cavalry was eliminated as a threat from the field. As for the archers positioned between the Chilterns, they too fell victim to the ferocious charge of the English horse. Having wheeled around the marshy terrain in the centre and approached the Scots army on the flanks, riding to the rear and smashing into their formations, the archers stood little chance. The approach of the knights concealed by their own comrades braced in the Chilterns. With the flight and fall of the Scots cavalry and archers, the royal battles refocused their wrath on the immobile but stalwart Scottish Chilterns. This final challenge, however, proved a fight too far for the cavalry alone. Edward's cavalry circled the bristling formation of spearmen, attempting to probe and smash their way through the gaps, to no avail. The Scots' main infantry force thus remained unbroken for now. However, the English infantry were edging slowly towards engagement, and King Edward now deployed a deadly counter, his longbowmen. These volleys of arrows and bolts shredded the forward ranks of Wallace's formations, with many of Edward's men even taken up and throwing stones to increase the pressure. Slow and methodical volleys of the deadly missiles thus eroded away the Scots rather than smashed through them, as the cavalry had wanted. One source describes the Scots falling like blossoms in an orchard when the fruit has ripened. Inevitably, the ranks of the Scots thinned and gaps began to appear, thus providing the cavalry the chance to force a path to cutting down the spearmen close up. With this breakthrough, the Scots Chilterns were compromised. However, they still easily outnumbered the English cavalry. Though our major source, Walter of Gisborough, makes no overt mention of the infantry moving in to complete the victory, this is highly likely. Many hundreds were killed making for the relative safety of the woods. Included among those who did escape the disaster were William Wallace himself, along with a few of his inner circle. Wallace retreated north and made sure to gut Stirling as he did so, only leaving the house of the Dominican friars intact, which King Edward took as his headquarters. The defeat at Falkirk irreparably damaged the prestige of William Wallace. His brief authority and title of Guardian had been reliant on his success, and now he resigned his post, retreating to his Vega role before his startling ascendancy a few months before. Wallace did serve his king as a diplomat, visiting the French court in 1299. He also may have visited Rome around the turn of the century, returning to Scotland by 1303. As for Edward and his victorious host, despite heavy losses and the discrediting of Wallace, Falkirk was not a crushing end to Scots resistance. Wallace would remain a painful symbol for English doubt throughout the period, a living example of how Edward's armies could be defeated. Wallace had been humbled, but the Scots patriot was still alive, and as the mighty English monarch aged inevitably to his own end, a new champion would rise to challenge and expel the hated English. If you stayed around this far, thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment as a sacrifice to the algorithm. You can also support us on Patreon and get ad-free early access to our videos for as little as $1, or by clicking the thanks button below to leave a one-time tip. As always, we'll see you in the next one.